there isn't many game sequels that get sub-serious of a sequel and still remains great, but that's exactly what Capcom's 1993 release of Super Street Fighter II The New Challengers is. Absolute one-on-one beat-em-up game in perfection, the absolute pinnacle of what a game in this genre should be. So why not just call these sub-series of Street Fighter II something else different entirely? These do get a little confusing over time, right? Now, the way I look at these games, which are put together from the source game being 1991 Street Fighter II, is pretty much down to refining the original game. Updates or DLC in today's world would be a good way to look at these. This game is the 4th title in this sub-series, and it is the next game to be released after 1992 Street Fighter II Turbo. So, what are the additions to this game then? Well, like I just said, take a look at this game as a major update which refines the existing characters and improves the in-game fighting mechanics, so everything is so much tighter than the previous installment. This is also using the famous Capcom CPS2 hardware, meaning that the graphics and audio have both had upgrades too. We also have a few new characters added in this game, which is why I talked about the DLC just a minute ago. The new characters here are Cammy, DJ, Fei Long and T-Hawk. Cammy in particular is a great new character to play as and definitely a welcome addition, whereas Fei Long is more or less a Bruce Lee style character. We also have a few new backdrops too, which are also nice to see, and these new backdrops of course accompanies the new characters in this game. We also get various other upgrades too, such as the combo scoring system, as well as a brand new and fresh looking HUD, which made everything look a little more modern for its time. And comparing this with Street Fighter II, which I've also previously covered in this arcade port series, as well as the original Street Fighter game from 1987, then yes, The New Challengers is a significant game that modernised many things for a new generation at the time. So today there are several home conversions of this much loved beat 'em up game to go through. So let's rank from worst to best the very best home conversion that you could have had of Capcom's 1993 classic Super Street Fighter II The New Challengers. Now, although this game certainly doesn't look great, as an Amiga fan myself and having covered 2 other Amiga Street Fighter games in this series, then this is probably the best Street Fighter game on this platform, and considering that US score to release this is quite an achievement to have a fairly playable version too. It released in 1995, at which point many Amiga users were well into the 32-bit console generation, so many likely would have missed this altogether. But if like myself you had an Amiga, you were most likely fairly chuffed with this home conversion. I remember personally buying this brand new from Electronics Boutique, and this would have been one of the very last Amiga games sold commercially. I do, however, remember not playing this game too much as it was a little annoying in terms of loading. I played this on the Amiga 500 at the time, and having 7 floppy disks was a little overkill. If only I owned 6 external drives at the time, then things would have been a little better with this game. So what we have here is of course an extremely cut down version of the game, but really what do you expect? If you was playing this like myself on the Amiga 500, you were effectively trying to run a CPS2 game on an 8-year-old computer. But at this day and age, we've got WHD load, and running this real emulator or even using WHD load on real hardware is a breeze, and it also means that we're not going to run into a corrupt floppy disk, which is going to ruin the whole game. The opening of the game doesn't actually look that bad. The animation of Ryo pulls it off very good. Sure, there is no sound here, but it gets the job done nevertheless. The main game screen menu gives us options in which we lower or heighten the game's difficulty level. We also get a choice of music or just sound effects. I opted for music and was only expecting music during gameplay. What I actually got though was sound effects as well as music. However, there are sound effects missing though, such as the final win where another fighter or yourself lets off his or her last agonizing sound before dropping to the ground. As you can see, I played as Cammy as she is my personal favourite character to play as within the new challengers, and she controls surprisingly well with just a D-pad and single fire button. It's just really a case of getting used to these controls. Sprite-wise, I mean, like I said, this is an old computer at this point of release, and this actually being a US Golden release, and everything looks surprisingly good for what it is compared to some of their other games. Don't expect parallax scrolling or even animated backgrounds though. What you see here is essentially two fighters that move, and that is it. We do get the combo scoring system appear though, which is pretty cool. I mean, like I said, this ain't a bad conversion, and I really can't criticise it too much for what it is. If I was to criticise anything, it would likely be the slight slowdowns that it gets from time to time. If there was ever a game that showed off the Amiga AGA capabilities against the older Amiga computers, then the new challengers for the Amiga 1200 was a good way to do this comparison. Right from the get-go, we have the opening of Ryo with his Hadouken blast, and this looks much more refined than that of the OCS and ECS Amiga versions. In fact, we even have sound effects to go with it here. And there's some nice touches with the options menu too. Dependent on the part of the world you lived in at the time, we have a POW as well as an NTS screen refresh option. You'll also notice with this AGA version that we don't have an option for music or sound effects. This version contains both automatically, and it really sounds like it too. It's awesome. From the character selection screen, we have the moving sound as we move around the grid to select a character, complete with music too. The OCS and ECS release just contain the music. You can also see by comparison that the selection screen in itself has been majorly upgraded here with much more defined boxes. This looks pretty slick. As we get into the game itself, the colours are much more vibrant and sprites seem much more defined. And hitting those enemies as well as enemies hitting you really sounds good. It's most definitely got that beefier arcade punch sound about it all. We even get the final sound of another fighter or yourself going down just as a round closes after a win. If you happen to have owned a Amiga CD32 controller this time, this would have been even better as there's more buttons to use. I can safely say in terms of Street Fighter games for any Amiga system, then this AGA version, also by US Gold, likely would have been the definitive version to play. But again, just like the OCS and the ECS versions, this version released fairly late into the Amiga's life. I mean, by the time this released in 1995, Commodore itself had been out of business for around a year, but it just went to show how loved the Amiga was in its day. This version never had things like parallax scrolling either, but I will say it again, for those who know about bad US Gold games, then this game is pretty damn good, which also offers a fair challenge too. Both of these Amiga versions also contained very good hit collision detection. Now, I was really expecting FM Town's 1994 version to be a flawless conversion, and that's most definitely not to say it's a bad version, because it's actually very playable. Although, mainly within this arcade port series, I do tend to find the Japanese exclusive games to be a cut above most other versions. But like I said, I cannot really say that about the new challengers here. Firstly, this is a seriously time-consuming game to load, and considering this was produced on a CD and not a floppy disk, I might have expected loading time to be quicker, but this was slow. I actually had to use fast forward many times to speed up the loading times for this game. I was even surprised to find that after the versus screen appears, a load would then take place rather than going straight into fights. We are also missing some game modes too, which the next couple of versions had plenty of. What we get here is pretty much a straight up arcades game with some difficulty settings included. Now this version does undoubtedly feature some of the best reproduced music and sound effects, and that is simply because of its using of cue sounds. There are also animations in this FM Towns release which are missing too. A good example of this is Dulcim stage in India. The next versions features the elephant's trunks that moved around, but here most of those background animations are actually static. I also found that even used in the easiest difficulty settings, this game was extremely tough compared to most others in this video. Firstly, and sadly, I cannot get the sounds working for this MS-DOS version of the game, but judging from other videos on YouTube of this version, then I can safely say this is actually a really decent sounding game, and that depended of course on the type of sound card you were using. If you owned a higher end Sound Blaster type card, then this version was obviously a big upgrade from the Amiga games very easily, and it wasn't the only thing that received a major upgrade. This MS-DOS version was developed by a completely different team altogether. This is a Rosner Labs game, whereas the Amiga conversions was by Freestyle Software. Capcom even published this release, which proudly came to DOS users for 1996. It goes without saying that the 1990s was a really good era for PC gaming. Games really did begin to come into their own at this point. Those bad arcade ports that DOS users seen throughout the 1980s was clearly coming to an end at this point. You'll notice that this game pretty much has the lot, from animated people standing in backgrounds, to waving arms around, to birds flying around in the background. This all looks great and adds that little more to the arcade experience at home. And Rosner Labs didn't stop with the background animations either. We have parallax scrolling here too, which gives the game that much more depth and introduces that pseudo 3D look about it. We also have breakable objects with this version too. You can see this in Guile's stage with the two breakable objects on the left and right hand sides. I mean, really, as far as these free computer versions of the new challengers go, this is the very best out there. The colours are also more accurate to the arcade game too. The action seems much more polished, and it doesn't tend to drop in frame rates much either when the action gets heavy. The only possible criticism as such would likely be the size of the sprites. I mean, characters in the game itself do look fairly skimpy when compared to the arcade release and also particular console versions, but really if you had this version and a decent sound card as well as some really good control pads, you were truly on a winner with this 1996 game. It doesn't matter which way around I place this Mega Drive version and the next version in this video, somebody out there will likely say I got it wrong. You were either Club Sega or Club Nintendo back in the day, so let me give you the reasonings behind putting this Mega Drive game here first. Well, firstly, and this cannot be denied, this 1994 release by Capcom doesn't sound too great, and that goes for the music and sound effects. This really does stand out from the moment the introduction begins, and sadly, more times than not, this Sega Megabit cartridge sounds very distorted. Although voice samples aren't bad at all, on the flip side, then this version compared to the next version offered brighter colours. But this all comes at a cost of having less visual effects happening here. For example, parallax scrolling and those little details like birds flying in the background aren't as prominent with this game. Although blood effects are here, and Sega never really did hold back from offending people this way. This awesome 16-bit Sega console release also had two exclusive modes thrown in, which were battle mode as well as the score challenge mode. This Mega Drive game is also slightly slower too in terms of frame rate compared to the next 16-bit console version in this video. So really, this is a case of swings and roundabouts with this release, and that is why I made the comment at the start of this version explaining that somebody will likely say I've got this wrong. All I say then is that I sincerely apologise for that. One last little annoying aspect of this version is that the stock Mega Drive controller that most people had back in the day only had 3 action buttons, which required players to press the start button in order to switch between kicks and punches. course, the next version had to be for the Super Nintendo. I mean, which other console rival was there in the west of the world during this 16-bit era? The school playground argument was mainly Sega versus Nintendo, and surprisingly and really awfully, that school argument still exists today in some cases. So then, why did I decide with this version over the Mega Drive version? Firstly then, the sound is superior. It sounds much more like the arcade game, and hitting other enemies and vice versa sounds very beefy and chunky here. That tinny and distorted sound that Sega's 16-bit console had isn't here at all. This sounds very premium, in other words. Sadly though, the accurate arcade music and sound effects is let down by the less convincing sound samples. Now, like I said, the Mega Drive game is known to be slightly slower in terms of frame rates. However, this is the faster version, and it really does show when I come face to face with Fei Long. This particular background and fight tends to drop in frame rates in most versions I've covered so far in this video. However, here with this 1994 Capcom release, this isn't really too noticeable. It runs fairly perfect here if comparing them side to side. A really good feature with the stock Super Nintendo controller though is that we have more action buttons. 4 buttons as well as the shoulder buttons. This means that using a particular button to switch between punches and kicks isn't necessary here, and it performs that much better for it when playing the game. We pretty much get what we really want here, plus a couple of other game modes, but we of course don't get what Sega users had with 2 particular exclusive modes. Finally, and this goes without saying, this is obviously a 90s Nintendo game, and so blood had been completely censored out of this version, which isn't really a massive deal, so to speak. I mean, it's not really like Street Fighter was ever known to have excessive amounts of blood like Mortal Kombat had. All in all, it is a case of swings and roundabouts with both of these 16-bit console versions. The boss of a local music shop that I buy my vinyl records from watched my Pac-Man ports video a little while back, and he was truly blown away with how well it looked and performed on the Japanese computer, the Sharp X68000. Sure, this machine was responsible for the development of some CPS-1 games, but others had other development teams. The Sharp X68000 was a beast of a system, and this port of the new Challengers truly shows it in a big way. This was jointly developed by SPS and Capcom and released for extremely lucky Japanese fans of Street Fighter in 1994. Sure, this masterpiece of a port did come with 6 floppy disks originally, but considering how close to arcade perfection this version was, I am fairly confident to say that most would have let this slide. This is running perfectly for 4MB X68000 machines, so you would need an upgrade to run this version if you had less than that. I will always say that previously, whenever I've mentioned Sharp X68000 machines, a couple of people will say that it's not fair, as Britain or America, for example, likely did not own one of these computers in the day. I'd just like to say again that as well as having Japanese subscribers, we cannot discredit it or not even include this version, because this version did exist and many people outside of Japan could easily acquire one of these machines these days, if you have a lot of money to spare, that is. And if you thought the Amiga 1200 costs a lot of money, you haven't seen nothing yet. I'll be honest, I actually thought this version was better than the original arcade game itself. It just seemed that much smoother to play, and the visuals just seemed to pop out that little much more. Just like every other system that the new Challengers was ported for, this also of course had 2-player mode as well as having a string of other options such as difficulty settings. And what's even more awesome is that Capcom released an arcade stick for this version at the time. This truly was the arcade at home, and those credit card sized emulation machines that scammers are selling these days simply didn't exist back in 1994. Super Street Fighter II, the new challengers, have seen emulated versions in recent years from the PlayStation 4 to Switch, but I won't be mentioning these or the 32-bit console era compilations of Street Fighter, as again, these by the seams of it weren't developed specifically for those machines, but they were just emulated ports. Anyways, that is it for ranking every new challengers port today. Did you necessarily agree with my choices in today's video? I will also remind you not to squabble over the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo versions. I know how easily this is done. I do read the comments. Anyways, if you're new to this channel and you want to catch up with all of the arcade ports videos that I've covered so far in this series, I'll leave a link in the comments section for you to check those out. But again, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay retro.
Fight.
1 year after the original Mortal Kombat game released in arcades for the August of 1992, Midway didn't sit around waiting to work for the sequel for the game. The hype and buzz that the controversial first game received was enough to assure them that a sequel was an instant no-brainer to produce. And success for a sequel was inevitable if this was done right. Again, just like the original game, Midway had its own in-house development team work on the sequel, and the aim of it was to improve the gameplay mechanics, including better controls, as well as adding additional finishing moves. And it was this game which introduced the multiple fatalities feature too. To top everything off, Mortal Kombat 2 gives us a slightly more darker look with a much more vibrant colour palette used, as well as adding multiple layers of parallax scrolling too. Now, you might think that the controversy that the original game had might have died off a year later when the sequel released, but it didn't. It continued to be one of those games that the mainstream media deemed as promoting violence through its realism. But that was the times, and yet Mortal Kombat 2, despite the media and a handful of concerned parents, the game became a massive success and even won several awards in its day. Many people would even say that the sequel is perhaps one of the best games ever made, and very easily one of the best in the Mortal Kombat series. So the game itself follows the lore of the original game and expands on it too. And with any expansion, we need new characters to introduce to widen the storyline. Introduced to us in this sequel, we have Baraka, Jax, Kitana, Kung Lao, and Melina. The game even came with 3 hidden opponents who we could actually fight too, which were Jade, Noob Saibot, and Smoke. The gameplay structure largely remains the same despite all of these new additions added. We choose a player to play as who represents Earthrealm. We need to win 2 rounds brutally fighting against the opponents in the Outworld where this game is set. Anyways, we have 10 ports of the arcade game to get through today, so from worst to best, today we are ranking the very best port that you could have played on Midway's 1993 classic, Mortal Kombat 2. You might look at the Amiga port of the game and think that I've completely lost my mind in ranking this in the lowest possible place here. I will admit that after playing the original Mortal Kombat game for the Amiga, which was a fairly faithful port to the source game with some fairly good and responsive controls, this 1994 sequel release was a huge downgrade in terms of its controls. Now, you might assume that we only have one action button for Amiga games, wherein most times this is true, but we actually have options to use 2 buttons with this version if you wish. But even by selecting a 2-button pad option and using an Amiga CD32 controller, this game is virtually unplayable because of its broken controls. Now, I obviously did my research and wondered if I was somehow getting some setting wrong with this, but no, others have complained with the unresponsive controls with this game, and it's a real shame because it certainly looks the part and even the music and sound are fairly top notch here. It could be then by 1994 Probe, who developed it for the OCS and ECS Amiga computers, gave up on it entirely or had an extremely tight deadline to finish the game by. Most people had moved on to the console generation by 1994, making this likely one of the last commercial Amiga games to release. But like myself, you probably were annoyed that such a decent looking game was wrecked by its shocking controls and delays that came with it. There were two ways to play this too. If you had a 2 meg of memory computer, then the gameplay would have been much smoother than the 1 meg version. Something else that many complained about with this release were the long loading times across 4 discs. Thankfully though, today we have WHD load, but even still, there is no reason to play this version, even if the loading times are 90 times quicker than the original 4 discs.
Come here!
Visually, this 1994 Sega Game Gear port, in which Probe Software developed and acclaimed release, looks fairly good for a mere 8-bit portable game. Probably one of the nicer looking Game Gear games too, but sadly it fails badly with the poor frame rates, as you will see from the gameplay footage. It's very choppy and pulling off moves can seem a little delayed at the best of times due to these issues. For a fast-paced fighting game, we need those moves to react instantly to the buttons that we're pressing. We only have 2 buttons to use here with the Game Gear version, although the start button does act as a block button too, but this was extremely awkward to use due to the start button's positioning on the handheld itself. With most 8-bit ports of arcade games, sacrifices are to be made. We get to play as just 8 of the characters here, meaning that Raiden, Baraka, Johnny Cage, Kung Lao and Noob Saibot have all been removed here. We also have just 2 regular backdrops here to fight other contenders with, although bosses have different arenas. We do get a choice between 3 difficulty modes, and easy mode is actually a fair challenge. The music isn't groundbreaking, but again, just like every other factor, this is a 8-bit portable machine attempting to pull off a fairly advanced arcade game. Now, the issue with the Sega Master System release is pretty much the same as the previous Game Gear version. It looks fairly good, well, as far as this 8-bit console could do, that is. Again, the problem is that despite being very cut back to allow for hardware limitations, the controls and gameplay itself are utterly destroyed through its pure choppiness. This Master System game is literally the same as the previous version in this video, but it would have been nice for Probe to give console players something a little different than a direct copy of their Game Gear game. The only reason this version made it one higher in this list is because of its bigger screen. And although the Master System controller only has 2 action buttons, if we want to block here, we don't need to press a button on the Master System unit itself. Probe actually made a button combo here by pressing down on button 1 and button 2 simultaneously. Finally, although there was blood in the portable Game Gear version, it is much more clear here to see. And let's face it, we play Mortal Kombat partly to see the gore. Let's not beat around the bush here. Honestly, I wasn't expecting to rank the Game Boy release higher than the Game Gear version, but here we are. Yes, this game is presented in monochrome, but the positive thing with this port is that it responds amazingly in comparison. The game is virtually the same as the Game Gear's offering, but like I said, for a combat game like this, those controls and fluid gameplay definitely need to be refined for an enjoyable experience. And this version, although less aesthetically pleasing, gives us that. Probe, who also developed this version, wasn't thinking about visuals over gameplay, and it really does show here. The music really isn't bad here either for a Game Boy game. We get no voice samples for characters here either, but I mean, come on. You surely wouldn't expect all of this for a portable console now, would you? It goes without saying, Mortal Kombat 2 was too much of a huge game with big money involved, and it was inevitable that these 8-bit portables ended up with their own versions. Having said all of this, I actually found this sequel a better game than the original Mortal Kombat Game Boy port, which I covered last year in this arcade port series. Something else which is a little easier here is the start button, which acts as the blocking button. Although irritating, it's a little more convenient to press whilst playing rather than the Game Gear's button. On reflection of the 8-bit versions of the game, it's really sad that even these were more playable than the technically superior Amiga version, even though these 8-bit versions were severely cut back. This is the point of the ranking where things are going to get very nitpicky from now on, and controversial too. So here we go then. This is the Japanese PlayStation exclusive, which released in 1996. Most other home conversions released in 1994, but the Japanese audience had to be patient for this one. Was it worth the wait? Well, many will argue, and this includes myself, probably not. In quick comparison with the 8-bit versions, then we do get all 12 characters here. And yes, it does look pretty good, but it's mainly the loading times which are the absolute deal breaker here. We get loading in between rounds, loading prior to fatalities taking place, loading between the game introduction images, we even get loading pauses when certain characters perform particular moves. You'll notice when the game is loading and pausing to load the data as we get a small box appear to indicate this with MK2. Talking about fatalities, the music continues to play as this is all taking place too. It's just a fairly annoying version to play. And the music and sound effects aren't really the strongest point here with this PlayStation version either. Although I do think the voice samples we do get here are fairly clean. It really is due to the volume of loads that this version comes with that the game is just so annoying. In many ways, this Sega Saturn port is very similar to that of the previous PlayStation version, although rather than being a Japanese exclusive, Sega Saturn fans around the world could play this as it was released globally in 1996. Now, despite the Saturn version wasn't so annoying with loading the game every few seconds with the MK2 logo appearing, Probe did fix this for this version, but by many reports, many were still a little irritated by unnecessary loading times during gameplay. Personally, I didn't find this nowhere near as bad as the PlayStation's offering, but even still, most definitely not perfect. As I said, this and the PlayStation version are very similar in that the music and sound effects aren't 100% perfect, and voice samples are still missing in certain places with both of these 32-bit console games. I even noticed a slight bit of input lag too at times whilst playing, but overall I believe that this is the better version between the two of these, and we can even open up hidden characters too, just like the arcade game had. Collision detection is pretty spot on though, so I can't really fault that with that regard. Visually, the MS-DOS release looks fairly good. Those digitized sprites actually come up fairly nicely here, and certainly a step up above many other versions. The problem here is that the game sprites in-game move so stilted that the whole natural movement element has disappeared entirely. There is also some delays too when requesting to pull off particular moves in-game. Music and sound effects wise, well, that would depend on the sound card being used. If you wanted the absolute best sounds with this when it came out in 1994, then you would have been looking at spending a small fortune. In terms of its load times, then this actually loads much quicker than the PlayStation version. But having said all this, this version definitely isn't 100% perfect. I am not going to say that the Mega Drive port is a bad port, because it's far from it, and considering this is higher up in the list than the two 32-bit versions, it's quite the achievement. Of course, this is a 16-bit version, so there are some cutbacks made. Objects in the background, such as birds flying in the distance, well, they're gone here. But considering how tight the gameplay is itself, then things like that can be forgotten about, and it isn't that bad at all. I mean, we do still get interactive backgrounds at times, and those unlockable characters are here too. The PlayStation and Saturn had the larger size sprites emulating the arcade version a little nicer, and their digitized looks made the game look a little more authentic on those platforms too. But still, despite the smaller scale sprites here, the Mega Drive pulls everything off surprisingly well. In terms of colours used, then you could argue that the colour palette used here is a little dull in comparison with upcoming versions in this video. But really, this is being nitpicky gimmicky. What makes this 1994 game fairly attractive is that if you happen to have owned a 6-button controller, then by going to options we can actually enable it rather than using the stock Sega Mega Drive controller with the default 3 action buttons. If anybody remembers the release of this version, you'll remember that the Game Boy and Game Gear versions, as well as the next version in this video, were all released on the same day in 1994, and this went by the name of Mortal Friday. The Sega 32X release arrived in 1995, and it's probable that this is the only version that had a handful of people who actually bought it or played it at the time. The 32-bit console was in full swing in Japan, and the rest of the world would be getting ready for the PlayStation and Saturn releases going into 1995. And to be fair, if you owned a Sega Mega Drive, then the fairly expensive 32X upgrade plus the cost of this game weren't cheap either. So what do we actually get as an upgrade then? Well, firstly, this is very similar to the 16-bit version, only the colour palette is enhanced, offering more colours where it doesn't look as dull. You'll also find this comes with more detailed environments too. The same music and sound effects are also here, and some of those questionable voice samples are still here too. You might have thought that the music itself might have had an upgrade, but no, comparing this and the Mega Drive version side by side, they are virtually the same in terms of sounds. Having said that, the 32X version does feature more voice samples. We also get a full arcade introduction to the game, which wasn't included with the standard Mega Drive release. If we strip back a few of the extras which the 16-bit console failed to have, the gameplay largely remains untouched. We can also go to the options here in order to use extra buttons controllers. I literally rank this above the Mega Drive game due to its nicer looking visuals.
Round 2. Fight.
In first place then, I have placed the Super Nintendo version. Now, the original Mortal Kombat port was originally highly censored for this platform. Those were the days when Nintendo hated everything to do with violence. But considering that the Sega Mega Drive versions outsold the Super NES version for that reason, on the release for Mortal Kombat 2, SNES fans had the joy of uncensored gameplay, meaning that we had everything in the game as it was intended, complete with gore. Sadly though, those in the Super Famicom regions did get a censored with green blood and fatality screens in black and white edition. The game itself, providing you had the uncensored release, was probably the closest you might get to the original arcade game. The music and sound effects are superior to that of the Mega Drive's offering, and the colours are much more vibrant here, where the sprites seem to stick out more from their backgrounds. We also get more voice samples here, and Nintendo's 16-bit console really pulls it off only too well here. Now, of course, the sprites here aren't as big as those of the 32-bit consoles, but considering everything else and the flawless gameplay here, then this is likely the only noticeable sacrifice. Interestingly, whilst Probe developed the majority of the other versions in this list, this game was developed by Sculptured Software. Although Acclaim still released it for 1994, could it be that if Sculptured Software developed the other versions that this ranking could have turned out very different? Who knows? One of the best features of all here, though, is that we have an 8-man elimination match, aka the tournament mode. And that's it for today's Arcade Ports video, so drop us a comment in the comment section and let me know which game you would have put in first place today. If you're new to this Arcade Ports series, I'm going to drop a link in the comment section so you can check out all the previous episodes that I've done. Anyways, again, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay retro. Daytona USA, probably one of the most well-remembered and well-loved arcade racing games in the 90s since OutRun, and this was also Sega's creation, which released in 1994, just 2 years after their other successful racing simulator, Virtua Racing. I am certain that by this point, Sega had most definitely sealed the deal that they were the very best for this genre of game. Funny I should mention Virtua Racing, as Daytona USA was also developed by the same team, AM2, only this time they were using a much more superior updated hardware board. Yes, this was the very first game to utilise the famous Sega Model 2 board. That famous board which also powered and gave us games such as Virtua Cop and Sega Rally amongst many others. Arcade games were becoming to look more realistic now, and games like Daytona USA showed this really well. Of course, it obviously still looks like a game with its bright vibrant colours, very reminiscent of this era that is, but those polygon style graphics from the Sega Model 1 era were becoming less obvious to see here, and all of a sudden previous racing games like Virtua Racing suddenly looked old in comparison. This was totally Sega style, once again ahead of the game, being pioneers of arcade. So how did Daytona USA become one of the best arcade racing games of all time? Well, in the early days of development, Sega of America wanted to base a new racing game around NASCAR, whereas Sega of Europe wanted to base it around Formula 1, as this was much more popular in Europe at the time. In the end, NASCAR was favoured, and Sega began negotiating with Daytona 500 representatives for a licensing deal in order to base their new game around the Daytona International Speedway, which would have likely have featured real drivers and real cars within the game. Eventually, and due to cost, Sega decided to scrap a licensing deal with Daytona 500 and went for a fictional world. In the background of development, Sega was waging a war against Namco, who had recently released the extremely popular Ridge Racer around a year prior. In other words, if AM2 couldn't make a better game, then don't bother. And since Ridge Racer received better reviews than that of, say, Virtua Racer, Sega needed this release to be as good as possible. Now, some sources these days will claim that while Ridge Racer was the better selling game in 1994 around the world, Daytona was literally just behind it. But regardless, Daytona USA is a well-loved game, much like Ridge Racer. If you have never played the game, which is very doubtful, the original arcade game is very simple. We choose from 3 courses to play, one being easy, one being medium, and one being hard in difficulty levels. We can choose between manual or automatic transmission, and the aim is to complete the courses in first place if possible. A very standard arcade racing game of the time. But anyways, we have 7 different ports of the game to rank from worst to best today, so without further hesitation, let's rank the best home version of Sega's 1994 release of Daytona USA. Released as a launch title in the West for the Sega Saturn, Daytona USA had a lot of hype to live up to, and especially that this was pushed as a game to sell Sega's new 32-bit console, and of course to earn it positive reputation. Sadly though, as players booted the game and expected a similar experience of the gorgeous looking arcade game, they were met with some disappointments, graphically speaking at least that is. Of course, nobody expected this port to be 100% identical in every way, and back in 1995, arcade-ported games for home consoles and computers were still relatively underpowered to take on such complex tasks. The huge and most noticeable difference here is the visuals themselves. This version of course displays more blatant polygon-looking visuals, and the game's resolution is much smaller than its source game too, meaning that those smooth visuals have been replaced here by blocky-looking visuals. One of the things here which really hinders the gameplay though is its draw distance. Now, we can excuse this for the beginner's course, as this is pretty much a circled course, which is pretty easy to remember, but the other 2 courses can become an issue as to see what is coming with such low draw distance, and being a fast game, a quick turn within seeing a bend 2 seconds prior can be an instant crash. I do remember this 32-bit era really well, and I do remember that some games did have longer draw distances than other games, but this particular game could have been much better. Now, if you can get past these hardware limitations, where 20 FPS still seemed acceptable to some extent, the handling of the game is perfected here. Turning corners, braking, everything feels really tight, so there's absolutely no complaint in that department. We get the original music too, which seems to be a little more updated, as this was re-recorded using live instruments to give it a fresh new sound. As well as the arcade mode, we also get an exclusive Saturn mode too. From here, we can race the same 3 courses as normal, or we can play mirrored courses. And it's also through here that we can unlock new cars. And if any of you were that great at this version, then you could even unlock a horse too. Very random, but yes, the horse could be raced in manual or automatic. Like I've said, if you can get past the visual imperfections here, you have a fairly decent 32-bit racing game. 1996 brought Windows 95 PC users a Sega Saturn port of the game, although this did come with some improvements in terms of visuals, and this was due to its different usage of hardware acceleration, which was Windows Direct Draw API. Much like other PC games, we do have a few video options to toggle here, and the default resolution here is higher than that of the Saturn game, which was running at just 240p. Here though, its default resolution is running at 640 by 480, meaning that this slight jump does offer clear visuals with 480p. Now, to be clear, if you owned a PC back then and wanted the best video settings possible, you might have likely have struggled to run it with a consistent frame rate. But like I said, there are video options here to decrease the resolution and run the game a little smoother. But this would have come with the cost of disabling background scenery and giving it more of a wired look. If you take a look at the wired visuals here, of course we can only really see the tracks and cars, but this dramatically improves the gameplay performance. And we can even make the draw distance a hell of a lot nicer to look at here rather than the Saturn's offering, which makes the game much more playable, especially if you aren't used to the layout of the 3 courses. Today in 2026 we can run this game at the best settings possible with ease, but back in 1995 this would have been a demanding game to run. In terms of everything else here, it is virtually the same game as the Sega Saturn had. We still have another additional mode like the Saturn release, but this one is known as PC mode, which offers us the same with mirrored courses and unlockables. It's said that Japan had 2 versions of this PC port. The other version was known to cater for people using different video card hardware, as at this point the PC gaming industry was constantly changing. With customers and some reviewers complaining over the launch release of Daytona USA, Sega decided to work on another version which released in 1996. This was the vastly improved Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition. Sega AM3 developed this version and it runs from a modified Sega Rally game engine. With this edition comes many more features than the standard release, but the highlights here really are the visuals themselves. Here we have a much more improved draw distance, and so seeing further into the distance as we race around courses is much easier to see when those corners are approaching us. We also go from the original 20 FPS to a stable 30 FPS. And just remember, prior to 60 or 120 FPS becoming a standard, 30 FPS was a very acceptable thing back in the 90s, especially for a console. We also now have an option to use the 3D analog controller, or even better still, we could plug in the official Sega Saturn steering wheel and get even closer to the arcade experience. Above these well-needed visual adjustments and additional controller support, we even get new additional courses here. And for the very first time, rather than the courses being labelled as beginner or expert for example, these are all given names at the course selection screen. The entire interface has had a makeover and it looks great for it. We no longer have a special Saturn mode, but this is made up of having a time attack mode and a 2-player option. Oh, and we also get many cars to choose from to play with this version. version. On the downside, we no longer get the original Daytona music here, as I'm guessing that Sega want the whole package to seem fresh at the time. If you were to play the original Saturn game and then play this version straight after, it really does feel like a breeze of fresh air. European players also had the privilege of playing it without black bars on the top and bottom of the screen, which the original game had, and in fact that was very common for PAL games I had back then for the Sega Saturn. But here we get to play Daytona USA in full 4:3 aspect ratio goodness. Remember the original Windows 95 PC release? Well, just like the Sega Saturn had another chance to shine, Windows users did too, and just like the Saturn Circuit Edition, this Deluxe Edition truly is a massive upgrade. This is pretty much the same deal as the Circuit Edition too, although this version is obviously titled as Deluxe. The real difference here though is that for the first time we could play Daytona online in up to 8 players simultaneously. Sure, this is laughable today with online games reaching masses of people, but this was pretty exciting stuff when this version released in 1997. We also get an extra track here which is exclusive for this PC version. This is known as the Silver Ocean Causeway. The game by default runs perfectly, although we can still play around with the video settings as you do if you're a PC gamer. In terms of gameplay, it controls tightly. Really, I'd place this version above the second Saturn release due to the higher resolution visuals, and the fact that it played online as well as featured a bonus track. This was simply the best version at this point, and Windows fans were over the moon with it in comparison to their original purchase of the game back in 1995. Love it or hate it, the Sega Dreamcast version, which released in 2001, gave fans of the now dating arcade original a definitive experience in several ways. I said love it or hate it as some people weren't too keen on the control mechanics when playing with the original Dreamcast controller. But if you got used to it, or even better still, used a steering wheel, then this did everything that the Windows Deluxe Edition did and added more to it. I would likely say that graphic-wise, this version is on par with the arcade game itself. As many of you will be aware, the Dreamcast was an absolute powerhouse in its day, and even blew me away at the time with just how good most of the games looked. Although even in the early 2000s the internet still wasn't widely used like it is today, we did get an online function with this game, which on many accounts made the game more attractive to buy at the time. As I have mentioned in other parts of the game in this video, draw distance has been an issue in many versions, but here there is no issue at all. We get to see everything with no sudden pop-ups of scenery. We have plenty of time to plan our moves, as we can now see corners on tracks with all the time in the world to spare. In terms of frame rates, then this matches that of the arcade original game at 60 FPS stable, and you will see no slowdowns here. The visuals truly look outstanding here, and was most definitely one of those games that seemed unreal for a console at the time. Music wise, well, these are remixes with this version, but they do sound good and definitely reflect that early 2000s era. If you like switching different camera angles whilst playing, then I would likely say that the transition of doing so here looks amazing. Just watch as I switch between views. There are 8 tracks to race, but a total of 32 tracks if you take the 4 different modes of play into account, which reverses courses or mirrors them. One of the modes included here, that being the championship mode, is a really awesome mode for this game. It's where we need to meet certain positions in races to progress further into the game. This alone made this Dreamcast version seem like much more than just a standard arcade racing game. In joint first place, I decided to give this to the 2011 Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 Digital HD editions. These are both pretty much on par with each other and are considered as enhanced versions of the arcade classic. What is there not to like about Daytona USA in HD? It takes the arcade game and transforms it to the best it's ever looked at this point. This game looks truly gorgeous, and even more so when it released back in 2011. On top of the main arcade Arcade HD remaster comprising of 3 courses. We have an online mode here, an extras option which opens up to survival mode, challenge mode, which is very good fun and requires the player to take on tasks within certain amounts of time. It's probably my personal favourite to control too. Drifting around corners and basic movements with a stock controller are likely the best out of all of the various ports. Some will complain and have complained that it still feels old school in the way that it controls, and even how it looks with the clouds rotating as we turn around corners. But having said that, it is those quirks which makes Daytona USA Daytona USA. If you didn't get to play it back in 2011, having discontinued a couple of years afterwards, I'm fairly sure you can buy it on the Xbox store today. It is a definitive home version and likely better than the arcade game itself. And that's it for today's ranking video. Did you agree with this ranking today? As always, drop us a comment. If you're new to this arcade port series, I'll leave a link in the comments section that will take you to my arcade ports playlist so you can catch up. Anyways, again, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay retro. Whilst reading the comments on my Daytona USA arcade ports video just a couple of days back, I read that many people also have fond memories of Sega Rally Championship too, and I'll admit I was tempted to release this one first, but here you go. This is one of Sega's finest moments during the 1990s, a game that most would have played either in the arcades when it released for 1995, or more than likely its eagerly anticipated port for the Sega Saturn at the end of 1995, or 1996 depending on your region. Sega Rally has gone down in history as one of those games which is often cited as being one of the greatest games of all time, and for good reason too. If you loved Ridge Racer just a couple of years prior, then you might find some similarities here, as the director of Ridge Racer at Namco, Kenji Sasaki, was also behind this project too. Originally, the idea of having an arcade rally game seemed a little strange to some people, but as Kenji persisted, he desperately wanted to keep away from those types of racing arcade games which were becoming a little generic at this point in time, and so going down the rally route might just make this game stand out from the rest of the games at the time. The game was developed by Sega AM3 and also used Sega's famous Model 2 hardware to power the game, the same board that gave us Daytona USA 2 amongst many other popular arcade games. AM3 spent a good few weeks travelling through the American West Coast to Mexico and photographing their journeys to use as texture mapping for the game itself. So when you're next playing Sega Rally, you can think of the tracks and scenery as being real. Those photographs were eventually digitized to be wrapped around the 3D world within the game that you play. And it wasn't just texture mapping that made this game seem a little bit more realistic looking at the time, but the rally cars themselves are real too. The Toyota GT4, Lancia Delta Group A, and a hidden Lancia Stratos. We even get some sponsorship logos in the game too, which gives it that little extra authentic feel. Sega Rally Championship is a fairly tough arcade racing game where, rather than choosing a course to race based on difficulty level like many other games would do, this game begins at an easy stage, and providing you can reach the end of the course within the time limit, you will then move on to the next course, which advances in difficulty. We have a total of 4 courses and can race with either automatic or manual transmission. Anyways, as usual, we have several ports of the game to get through today, so let's find out which was the best home version of Sega's 1995 classic Sega Rally Championship. Although the Nokia N-Gage had a version of Sega Rally and is titled as Sega Rally Championship, it's considered as being closer to Sega Rally 2 rather than being a port of the original game. If you're outside of Australia, then you might not be aware of this version, as it only released in Australia in 2004. It was planned for a European and American release afterwards, but was ultimately scrapped. Whether or not it's because the Nokia N-Gage itself was a fairly confused console and mobile phone hybrid is questioned. Regardless of why it never happened. This version of Sega Rally Championship, which was developed by Hitmaker, is fairly poor. The gameplay footage that you see is obviously enlarged using emulation to showcase it, but playing this on the original 2.1-inch TFT LCD display wasn't the best. Now, we can excuse the visual side of the game here. At the end of the day, these games didn't look too bad for their time, but the release of the PSP in 2004 and 2005 instantly made it look fairly shoddy. As for the game itself, then, well, this is a unique take on the game, or an exclusive version, shall we say. Firstly, we have a few different cups we can play here, ranging from the Amateur Cup to the Sprint Cup. We also get more than 3 rally cars to race as here too, so the entire dynamic of the game has changed dramatically. But it's really about the gameplay itself here, which is why this N-Gage game deserves its place in the worst version. You will see that the draw distance is fairly bad here, even for a portable game of this era, but the worst thing here is the controlling of the car itself. Gone is the realism that Sega put into how the rally cars move around corners. Just slightly pressing left or right will make the car here look so unnatural, and often you'll crash into the narrow tracks and the cars look like they're jumping rather than colliding with things. Despite the tracks being very narrow, the game itself is so easy that it barely offers a challenge. Initially released in Japan for 2002, the rest of the world seen the Game Boy Advance version of Sega Rally Championship in 2003. A little like the Nokia N-Gage version, the Game Boy Advance game shares a little more similarity with the sequel here too. The game itself was criticised at the time due to its extremely poor visuals, that blocky look which some have compared with Duplo, and this ugly look gets worse as we play through the main championship mode, which comprises of 4 stages. Although the game does have a total of 6 new international courses in total. As we make it into the village stage, the buildings' scenery at times really displays how bad things can look. Again, just like the N-Gage game, this game also features roads which are very narrow, and the controlling of the car kind of feels like you're controlling the tracks themselves, and that the rally car is just there for show. In other words, the controls here are off, or at least don't feel too great. It's not all bad though. This Game Boy game is partially praised for its features that it came with. We get unlockable cars, tracks, and gameplay modes. We can connect up to 4 players in total using the Game Link cable. At the time, we could even use a dedicated website to paste in our timing results on certain modes within the game, in which case rally points would be rewarded alongside a password which we could enter onto the website, allowing us as the player to open up even more new features within the game. But as cool as all of this sounds, the gameplay really isn't there. Many would argue and state that it doesn't even come close to other Game Boy Advance racers such as Colin McRae Rally 2.0 or even GT Advance 2. So it isn't to say that this platform wasn't capable of a decent racing game, because it really was. If Sega Rosso, who developed it, refined the game prior to releasing it, then this could have been a solid game for Nintendo's portable. I'll likely get slammed for ranking the Java game Sega Rally 3D here, but let me explain. Sure, it's just a mere Java game from yesteryear's mobile phones, but as cut down as this was in terms of pretty much everything, including only having 1 car to play as, and just having a few rally tracks, the game is fairly playable, even if it did require pressing your number pad to move around. It's smooth, responsive, and looks fairly impressive for a Java game from 2008 with a fairly decent draw distance too. Rockpool developed this one, and it wasn't made clear if it was intended to be following the style of the other 2 portable versions, but it certainly looks like it in many ways. I thought I'd throw this version into the video, as many have talked about Java games in other videos in this arcade port series. Now, I really wish that I could have placed this higher in this ranking, but this Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network game, which went by the name of Sega Rally Online Arcade, releasing back in 2011, is a different game entirely. But we do get a bonus track here, which is specifically the Safari course. Although this looks fantastic and probably one of the best out of all in this video, this is sadly the only track included, which has been entirely remade using a modern day engine. Considering the original arcade track is fairly short though, Sumo Digital, who developed it, at least gave us a 3-lap race against a computer to soak in the gorgeous visuals. A real shame that Sumo never included anything else, but it's a nice touch to add as a little tribute to the original game.
Final lap. Easy right.
So here we are, after a few questionable portable versions and that awesome one-track affair with Xbox 360 and PS3, we are now at the point where everything else here are direct ports, as it were. And this begins here with this Windows 95 game, which Sega released back in 1997. Now, first and foremost, Sega converted the Sega Saturn version for Windows players to enjoy. And so what you see here wasn't a game built from the ground up, specifically designed for PC users as such, and for that reason the game lacks what most PC games have, and that is a multitude of screen resolution options. Here we get a choice of either 320 by 240 or 640 by 480. I am running it with the highest resolution on offer, which is 480p.
Easy left, easy right.
I have read stories that some people had issues at its launch with getting it to run correctly, or even having sound issues, where many were stating that it was a quick cash grab from Sega. Some even went as far to say that their controllers weren't compatible with the game and ended up using a keyboard to play the game instead. Bear in mind that by 1997, most PC gamers were accustomed to playing with controllers such as the Sidewinder. Other complaints ranged from the game always defaulting to the highest resolution, meaning that players would need to manually change it back to the lowest each time they wanted to play the game. Otherwise, they'd likely have suffered from poor frame rates. Having said this, we do get some options whilst in game, such as disabling and enable game effects. But as the game itself, I mean, it looks good and it also sounds great too. But you might have thought that PC owners might have been rewarded with some kind of bonus content. But Sega didn't really offer customers much incentive to buy it for PC at the time. I mean, in comparison, Sega released a deluxe PC edition of Daytona USA, which also released in 1997, and that even came with an exclusive track to race. Thankfully though, since its initial release, fans of the game over the years have created various patches, such as a direct 3D patch, which makes the game look so much nicer than it did originally.
Easy left.
For those outside of Japan, you might find it as a surprise to know that when Sega Rally 2005 released for the PlayStation 2, it originally came with a bonus disc, which was an arcade-perfect version of Sega Rally. Now, as much as this game looks great, which it truly does, the truth of the matter is so that this version is nothing more than an emulated version of the arcades game, which is why it comes with no extra features. It could be seen as a bonus though, as this PS2 game runs in 480p, which matches that of the arcade game itself. And at this moment in time in history, prior to emulators such as PCSX2 offering multiple scaling options, this truly would have been the best way of playing it outside of the arcade. Visually speaking, that is. Sadly though, like I said, if you were outside of Japan when this released, it was likely the case that you had no idea at all about its existence. Of course, today there isn't much point in playing this PS2 version unless you are a PlayStation 2 collector, as MAME emulation has come a very long way since those days, but even still, this little package would have delighted Sega Rally fans at the time.
Long medium right. 3, 2, 1, go.
Most of you are likely wondering what's in first place if the Sega Saturn version is placed here. Well, firstly, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this game. I mean, it's likely the best racing game for the Sega Saturn, and I think that goes without saying. It even goes down as one of the console's best-selling games of all time. Generally, critics loved it, and Sega Saturn players couldn't get enough of it when it released in 1995. It runs at 30 FPS and at 25 FPS if you were within the PAL region, which was absolutely acceptable for this moment in time. And although the game only outputs at 240p, running this on a CRT TV looks incredible to date. Some people would argue that it came with no additional features as such, and just a small handful of courses to race just like the arcade game. There were button combinations we could use in order to unlock new features, such as racing against the Stratos in the arcade practice mode. We could even unlock mirror modes using button combinations, or we could even go as far as unlocking a special mode too.
Very long easy. Sega Rally Championship.
In first place then, this is the 1996 Japanese exclusive version of the game, which goes by the name of Sega Rally Championship Plus, which is often referred to as the definitive version of the game. This is the same game as the original and standard Sega Saturn release, only this has been tweaked and enhanced in a few different areas. Firstly then, the Plus edition here allows the player to use the 3D control pad, which feels so much better when accelerating and braking. It also came packed with X-Band modem support too for playing with other players online, which was a fairly great feature to have in its day. To top all of this off, Sega also enhanced and improved some of the in-game textures, which in parts of the game look a little more defined and smoother with its slightly higher resolutions. In addition to everything here, this is also considered as a bug fix version 2, meaning that any imperfections or minor issues that came with the original release were fixed. I will note here though that North America did receive a Plus edition too. This was known as the Sega Rally Championship Plus Netlink edition, which also featured 3D controller support. But like I said, it's truly this Japanese exclusive version which includes everything else that I've already mentioned here. And that's it for today's ranking of Sega Rally. Did you agree with the order of this video? What would you have placed in first place? Leave a comment as always and let us know. If you're new to this arcade port series, I'll leave a link in the comments section which will take you directly to my arcade ports playlist. Anyways, again, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay retro.
Easy left, maybe. Medium left. Get ready.
Way back in 1986, Sega released one of the finest arcade racing games of all time. That game was of course OutRun, a game that I remember personally playing on in the early 1990s whilst on holiday. The game was superb. The idea of a racing game being less linear than the average run-of-the-mill racing game, which actually let us choose between courses whilst racing on the fly, was something really special. And of course we then have those bright colours and music, which is to some synonymous with some of the best memories. I mean, the music was and still is superb. After OutRun released, along came other games in the series such as Turbo OutRun, which changed the dynamic of the original game, and of course Outrunners, which again seemed and looked a little more like Power Drift to some degree. Of course we also had straight to console and computer games which skipped the arcade entirely, namely OutRun Europa and the Mega Drive game exclusive OutRun 2019. But despite all of these sequels and spin-offs releasing over the years, nothing touched the perfection of the game from 1986 which started it all. That was until 2003 when Sega released its true sequel, OutRun II, the first arcade OutRun game in 10 years, Outrunners being the previous game. OutRun 2 was met with pure joy, and most would agree that although AM2 who developed it made the game look modern through its visuals, which by the way still looks stunning to date, they also used use similar gameplay mechanics that almost feel similar to the 1986 game, rather than attempting to change things like Turbo Outrun once did. AM2 maintained the same structure of the game which made the original game so popular in the first place. You could say then that in some ways OutRun 2 was a nice updated version of the 1986 game. It's very rare that old schoolers with fond memories of the original game could actually rate this sequel as a much better game, but in many cases that's actually the case with this game. OutRun 2 really was that good. The game came with a couple of other versions within the arcades which were pretty much updated versions, such as OutRun 2 DX and OutRun 2 SPDX. And if you get confused with all of these letters after OutRun 2, well, OutRun 2 SP is also referred to as OutRun 2 Special Tours. And this is the version which contains the original 15 courses plus an additional 15 more of American themed locations. But then came along the home versions. These largely went by the name of OutRun 2006 Coast to Coast. And alongside the main career mode of Coast to Coast, most of these versions had its own conversion of OutRun 2 SP. And that's specifically what this video will be based on today. So today we are going to find out which version of Sega's OutRun 2 SP is the very best you could have played outside of the arcade. I can't really knock this PSP release of the game too much, but sadly one of the versions had to come in bottom place, and a portable version will likely always be inferior to that of a console or computer version of a game. As a PSP game though, this is one of the best racing games on the platform, and let's bear in mind that to have a game that performs so well with those impressive visuals all contained within a 4.3 inch screen is quite the achievement for Sumo Digital who developed it. Sure, those edges around objects do look fairly jagged today, but just because this is a mere portable system doesn't mean to say that console or computer versions of this game were entirely free from this. Now, don't get me wrong, there are other versions in this list that perform much better with higher frame rates. But like I said, something had to be considered as the worst version. This PSP game could also connect to a PlayStation 2, but a little more of that later in the video. It's very often that portable versions of games either get a different game tailored to the cutback hardware, or parts of the game have been taken away entirely. But what you get here is pretty much the entire game of Coast to Coast, and it's a very cool game for portable fans. The original Xbox actually received two versions of OutRun 2. The first to arrive was the 2004 standard OutRun 2 game, which was pretty much based on the original 2003 game. This is the second release, which goes alongside the more updated SP version of the arcade game, containing more stages and updated UI amongst many other things. This is the 2006 Coast to Coast version, which came along in 2006. Now, of course, just like any other version of Coast to Coast, we do get the option here to play the arcade game, which is of course based on the SP version. It's worth mentioning here first and foremost that the Xbox version here will output at 480p, matching that of the arcade game, and it also comes with widescreen support too. Best of all, this runs at 60 FPS. Now, depending on different accounts, it has been said that this version has taken a slight downgrade from that of the original Xbox standard OutRun 2 game in terms of its visuals. Some over the years have speculated that this is due to Sumo Digital, who developed it, putting more focus on the Coast to Coast content, and perhaps to some degree leaving the OutRun 2 SP mode to take a slight downgrade as a consequence of this. I personally remember buying this version when it released, and at the time this truly looks stunning hooked up to a CRT TV. I mean, quite easily likely one of the best looking Xbox games around. But if we take a look at it 20 years on, does it still hold up today? I mean, one of the great features with this version is the rumble support. As we brake, drift and crash, the Xbox's controller rumbles really nicely here. It contains all of the stages from the SP version version 2, so 30 in total. One thing that really does stand out today though is those jagged edges on pretty much everything that we see. From the white lines on the roads, buildings in the distance, pretty much anything that's supposed to be straight has taken a hit here. And it can come across as a little messy these days. One of the worst to suffer from this type of affair is the trees, which do come across as looking very fuzzy. I also notice that darker areas can come across as little washed out too in places. Now, going back to the controls, like I said, the rumble feature does the game a massive favour. It really feels that good. But the actual controlling of the car itself, whether just turning or braking, feels brilliant here. But where it totally shines is the drifting element. This feels really great when pulling off those long drifts around bends in the road. The game does support steering wheels too, although some will say that particular steering wheels are a little hit and miss with this game. In terms of sounds then, well, this sounds pretty good, and that iconic Splash Wave tune sounds as good as ever here. And the voice samples aren't too bad either.
Get ready.
Just like the original Xbox, the PlayStation 2 had two versions. This is the coast-to-coast version, which seen a worldwide release. This is very similar to that of the previous version in the video, and to be honest, this was a little tricky in ranking one version over the other. The big noticeable difference with this PlayStation 2 game is the vastly superior vibrant colours. Those jagged edges on objects in scenery, although are here, but to some degree are toned down a touch, and that's due to better anti-aliasing. This version also appears to be much sharper to look at too as we're playing through the game. Still, the game runs at a good 60 FPS, although this version does tend to play much more smoother, whereas the previous version in this video did at times appear to stutter in places, especially at the intersections prior to changing stages during the gameplay. On a downside though, this version has slightly lower textures and slightly longer loading times too. But regardless, this is still a solid part of the game, and it runs at a relatively well 60 FPS with an output of 480p, also offering widescreen support. Controlling the cars also feels great here. The feel of drifting around corners is just as good as the Xbox version. I did find here though that the music, sound effects and voice samples to be much more clear here. In the end, it comes down to personal preference between the Xbox game and this version. But just to sum things up in comparison, both of them run at 60 FPS, although the Xbox version did slightly lag at certain points. This version also has a better palette of colours being used, and I did mention that the Xbox game did seem to be a little lacking with colours in certain areas. Both versions of the game also output at 480p, matching the arcade original. But the most noticeable difference really between the two versions though is easily the jagged edges. The PS2 version just looks that much better in my opinion. In addition to my personal preference here, I'll also note that the Euro and American releases of the game also allow PSP users to link to the PS2, and we could even unlock a couple of new cars with this feature. Japan had its own version of the game, although it wasn't released as coast to coast. This was released as OutRun II SP, and this one released in 2007. Although Sumo Digital developed the game itself, Polygon Magic reworked this version and refined a lot of things. So you might call this Japanese exclusive game an update of coast to coast, which greatly improves performance, and that's very evident when playing this version in comparison with the original PS2 release of 2006, which Japan never received at the time. The frame rate here is by far the smoothest out of everything so far in this video. Again, this runs at an incredibly stable 60 FPS. This version also has improved textures too. Everything here from the car we're racing in to the scenery all around us all look that much more detailed. We also get ending animations such as volcanoes erupting, whereas the Western release was missing this entirely. And talking about visuals whilst we're here, that sunny beach stage contains a beaming sun which shines bright on both of these PlayStation versions. Whereas the original Xbox game didn't have this at all. Allegedly, that was an issue with the Xbox's bloom effects. If, like myself, you're a big fan of the splash wave theme during gameplay, then you'll be happy to know that we have a slightly more updated remix here too, which is the SP remix. In the Western versions of the game, we had cars to unlock as well as some unlockable music too, but here everything is available from the get-go of the game. Like I said, this is much like the Western coast-to-coast version, only this Japanese release improves on a few different factors as I've noted. This version also supports native support for steering wheels and force feedback too. The only thing that you might say is a slight downgrade here is the fact that the PSP link is not included with this version, and that's simply because Japan never had a PSP version of this game.
Get ready.
If you thought that the PlayStation 2 or original Xbox games looked stunning in their day, then the 2009 Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network games would have had your jaw dropping with how truly spectacular these looked. And although these two versions might be running on fairly dated hardware these days, they both truly still look incredible. Now, the one issue that these two digital versions had was that Sumo Digital, who developed these, had a fairly annoying 2GB size restriction for their game, which Microsoft put into place for arcade games at the time. And so because of this, these online arcade games had to be cut back in order to fit this size restriction. Amongst a few other things from the Coast to Coast game, annoyingly, the original 15 stages from OutRun II had to be removed, which just left the players with 15 stages. It was said at the time that maybe DLC would bring the missing 15 tracks at some point, but it never happened. 2010 seen the removal of the PlayStation 3 game from the PlayStation Network, and 2011 seen the removal of the Xbox Live Arcade version. This was down to Sega's contract with Ferrari expiring. Now, if you can understand the circumstances surrounding these cutback versions, you'll seriously have a blast playing these with its high definition makeover. Sure, it runs at 30 FPS, but it actually feels like it's running better than this. Both of these versions do run at a native 720p though. Something notable with these versions is that despite having 15 stages missing, not only do the visuals make up for it, but we also get that some might say has superior bloom effects to everything else that OutRun II SP released on. A quick honourable mention to the original Xbox exclusive version of OutRun II. Of course, this isn't the SP version featuring those extra 15 tracks, but it is nevertheless halfway there. And since I mentioned the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 games, which were also missing half of their stages, then this deserved to be here too. OutRun II for the original Xbox released in 2004. This was Sumo Digital's first OutRun II game, and again, much like the Coast to Coast version of the game which came a couple of years afterwards, this was also received extremely well in its day. This is an incredible arcade port. I'll end this video today just like I started it and say that it's very difficult to rank some of these versions, as to be fair, each one of them were superb games in their own right and have always been highly praised regardless of their platform. But considering the PlayStation 3 and Xbox digital versions were missing half the stages, then the Windows PC release is the more complete experience. And even better still, this can be ran at the original Arcade 480p resolution. But what makes this the best looking game out of all of them is having the ability to upscale it to 4K through video settings, and a fairly active modding community. Yes, this game is loved so much that even after 20 years, modders are still improving this game. In fact, I even made a tutorial on this just a little while back. You can truly make this game look breathtaking, and what's better still is that with today's modern hardware, achieving these settings for a 20-year-old PC game is a breeze. The great thing about this version, which also released in 2006, is that being a PC game, this is also fairly versatile in how we play it. From steering wheels to keyboards to controllers, this version pretty much caters for most things connected. And unlike the console versions of the game with jagged edges, we can even remove these with video options too. We can play it in widescreen mode thanks to the awesome community behind these modern day patches, and we can pretty much make this game look like a modern day game. Anyways, that's it for another arcade ports video. Which game do you think deserved to be in top spot? Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know. If you're new to this arcade port series, I'll drop a link in the comment section for the entire playlist as to what we've covered so far. Anyways, again, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay retro. 1980 saw the release of one of the most popular and remembered arcade games of all time, which today is still a household name and also known by a much younger generation too. Pac-Man is iconic to that period of gaming history known as the Golden Age of Arcade, which was between the late 1970s to the early 1980s. Some of the games released during this era have been totally forgotten about, while some still remain today, being it reimaginings or remasters of these classics. Games from Space Invaders, Asteroids, all remain truly iconic and encapsulates this golden age very nicely. As Pac-Man was one of the most popular and most talked about games of this time, sequels would be inevitable, and Pac-Man certainly was no stranger to sequels during the early 1980s. Largely all of the same game with slight alterations. Mus Pac-Man was the first sequel, which was pretty much just a case of Pac-Man having a bow and lipstick. And yes, this qualified as a sequel. Then came other games such as Junior Pac-Man. All of these games were fairly basic in concept and hadn't really evolved much until the release of Pac-Land, which was a side-scrolling platformer which I actually covered last year in this series. 1987 saw the release of a new style Pac-Man game which brought back the original concept of collecting dots scattered around mazes and avoiding different coloured ghosts, unless we of course had swallowed a power pellet, in which case we could gobble up any ghosts in our way. But rather than going entirely back to basics like the first few releases did, Namco modernised the game to fit with the times. And by 1987, arcade games had moved on a lot in terms of design, and so developing a new game which had already been done several times before might not capture a new audience. So we end up with Pac-Mania with what is known as an oblique projection perspective, which is a technique which converts three-dimensional images into two-dimensional images. Most will call this style isometric though. It largely remains the same game despite the new look. Although we can now jump over ghosts too, and ghosts can also bounce around, which seems fairly basic, but you would be surprised of how this new feature helps us in the game, especially when ghosts are attempting to surround us. And rather than travelling around mazes which look pretty much all the same, Pac-Mania had a variety of mazes that look different from each other too, comprising of 4 worlds in total. This whole new updated idea not only attracted a new audience but still appealed to those who loved the original set of arcade games. Just like most other Pac-Man games which came before, we also have a lot of ports too. So today we are ranking from worst to best the best home version of Namco's 1987 classic Pac-Mania. Although this Amstrad CPC port is in the worst place in today's Pac-Mania video, that's not to say that it's a bad game as such, but the problem is, and in comparison with the next couple of 8-bit computer versions in this video, then this game is lacking in colour, and it's not the actual mazes in the game either which can be excused, but it's actually the sprites too, which are the same colour as the mazes themselves. The Amstrad CPC could do much better than this. In addition to the lack of colours within the gameplay area, this game also tends to have a lot of slowdowns. Sure, the next couple of versions aren't free from this, but this is one of the slowest versions of the game here. Normally, with most versions, the slowdowns do occur when there are several ghost sprites on screen at any one time, but here you can just be roaming around without any sprites and the game still scrolls very slowly. was pleasantly surprised with the quality of the MSX release. For those who watched certain arcade ports videos from last year, you'll probably remember how terrible some of these games could be on this platform, especially those MSX games which were developed in Europe. Teak Software developed this and Grand Slam Entertainment released it in 1988. In fact, Teak Software and Grand Slam worked together for the majority of the home microcomputer ports of the game. Although Teak Software were British, they did actually do a really good job with this MSX game, and undoubtedly one of the better MSX games to come out of Europe at the time. Generally, I find MSX games, unless released in Japan, to be ports of the ZX Spectrum versions. Pac-Mania on MSX is a smooth and very playable version of the game to some degree. Sure, the hardware limitations are there, which resembles the ZX Spectrum look, but it manages to pull it all off really well, surprisingly. And the music is also pretty top notch here too. We don't get a difficulty level layout to choose from, as this puts us straight into the game. And we do have the right hand side border which gives us scoring information, but the look of the game is definitely there with its vertical screen looking appearance. And that whole isometric presentation looks very good here. We even get animated cutscenes in between levels from time to time. This is definitely an 8-bit micro game that you would have been really happy with back in the day. I'll admit that I was a little disappointed by the Namco 1989 release for the MSX2. Generally, MSX2 games perform better than its older brother computers. Sure, you can say very easily that this game is really nice to look at, and it really is. I mean, the colours used here to create that cartoon style look works really nicely here, and the sprite designs are fairly good too. The main issue with this is how the game staggers whilst we're playing it, as you'll notice from the gameplay. I mean, even the next version in this video plays smoother than this version, and as it scrolls so slow, it can sometimes be a little tough to determine when to jump over ghosts, as it's just not that fluid in movement. Sure, it's playable providing you get used to how it scrolls, and it even sounds good with sound effects right next to the music itself. I was just expecting much more from this version. It is almost like the game itself is a direct copy of the MSX1 version, only here we have colour. But we do have a continue option at the main screen, so we can play the game from where we left off. Although very similar to that of the MSX1 version, the ZX Spectrum version looked much sharper and the colours used here are much more vibrant looking. Pac-Man's yellow colour really pops out in comparison. Even the information border on the right hand side looks nicer here. Both Spectrum 48K and 128K users could enjoy this game, although the version I'm playing here is the 128K version, which gives us some really nice music by the legendary Ben Daglish. Whereas 48K users were just limited to sound effects only during gameplay. We also get sound effects as well as music with the 128K version, which is the only 8-bit computer version to feature both simultaneously. Generally, the music and sound effects does sound like a slight upgrade from most other versions covered so far. We also get a selection screen as for difficulty levels here, and I also notice that as more ghosts accumulate on the screen, the MSX version would slow down occasionally. Here though, there is definitely an improvement in terms of speed, to the point where even Ghost's eyes look much more smoother as they wander off after Pac-Man eats them. You might think I'm mad for placing this above the MSX2 game, but trust me, playing this port is much smoother, and jumping over Ghosts here isn't so much of an issue here due to poor frame rates. I'll be honest with you, I found it tricky to rank the Commodore 64 version, as it's very different from the other 8-bit computer versions, in that the others all went for that vertical look, like the arcade game itself. But here we have half a full screen gameplay area, where the bottom half has a fairly dull looking grey colour with some colour text on it. I mean, the gameplay here is pretty good. It's certainly responsive and runs at a fairly good pace, and the animated cutscenes look fairly good too. In fact, the gameplay gameplay area and the sprites themselves also look really good. Sadly though, I did feel that the music wasn't the strongest point of this version, and considering that this is a Commodore 64 game where the SID chip normally reigns supreme, I just didn't feel it much here. It also had no sound effects during gameplay either. I think it's the combination of the gameplay area and how it's displayed, rather than having a vertical look like most of the other 8-bit computers. The isometric look does look fairly nice here, but it also comes across as slightly stretched. The reason I rank this as the best 8-bit computer version though is simply down to this being a much faster game. Although Pac-Man does appear to be a little speedier than the arcade's game itself, it's much better to play rather than having a slow Pac-Man. The Atari ST port is more or less attempting to emulate the same look as that of the 8-bit computer versions, with the border on the right hand side. I mean, the game looks really nice here, and that isometric effect with the mazes also looks fairly good. The sprites also resemble the arcade's game really nicely. The issue I find with this ST version though is a couple of things. Firstly, although it's going for the vertical look, which is fine, it just seems like the gameplay screen here is fairly small and narrow, to the point that when ghosts are right next to us, we often have a split second to either jump or turn the other way. Out of most of the different versions in this video, I did find myself dying more times than any with this ST game. Secondly, I did find that the ST does struggle to keep a more stable frame rate. Generally, you will find that the computer versions do tend to slow down when moving horizontally, but here it happens when moving vertically too. The Sega Master System port was developed by Tech-Magic, a little team that came together in order to release a few Master System games initially. Tengen released it in 1991. So what is good about this port then? I mean, visually speaking, there are nicer looking Master System games around, and this does come across as fairly basic looking, and it's also on the little dark side in terms of colours used. Controlling Pac-Man and hit collision detection are all pretty much well implemented here. I did notice, however, at times that the ghost did come across a little laggy, almost like they missed a couple of frames and appeared in a slightly different place. Tech-Magic designed this just like the arcades game and nothing more. In general, console games do get options from the start screen, but this just takes us straight into that arcade style difficulty level selection screen. Although this 8-bit console version comes with music and sound effects, I did notice that the music isn't brilliant here compared with some other versions. I also felt at times that now and then the ghosts would be moving quicker than they normally would. All in all, the Sega Master System had a fairly good port of the game, but of course there are much better in the world of Pac-Mania ports. Here's the other 8-bit console version that Tengen released. Although this version was developed by a different studio altogether, this was by Westwood Associates and released in 1991. It's a much more brighter looking game than the Sega Master System's version, and the music and sound effects also sound enhanced here in comparison. Although the music and sound effects themselves aren't perfect, but that's down to hardware limitations. The colours of some of the mazes with this release are different from the arcades game, but that's of course due to Nintendo's limited colour palette. The isometric effect of the mazes aren't the best here with its design, but the game does seem to play smoother than the Master System's offering. You'll see this very easily with the ghosts themselves as they move around. They do appear to look much smoother here with much less sprite movement lag, but you will also notice some sprite flicker too, which is of course very common for most NES games anyway. A really nice added feature here, which not every port of the game had, is the ability to play the game as a 2-player. I was expecting the Commodore Amiga game to look the same as the Atari ST's version, as with arcade ports this is normally the case, and sadly it's generally said that the Amiga normally gets a port of the ST's version, but here we have a totally different game. As you can see, Pac-Mania is presented in full screen. Sure, it isn't vertical like I mentioned in the Commodore 64's version, but for how nice it looks, plays and sounds, then some sacrifices need to be made. Unlike the Commodore 64's version, we don't get that ugly looking grey border beneath the gameplay area. What we have here is a nicely developed 16-bit computer version of Pac-Mania. The sprite animation here is gorgeous and the maze design looks fantastic too. It's a responsive game to play where I found little lag in frame rates throughout. This is a great version in more than just one way. I'm sure that most would have been happy with this 1988 release. It's definitely one of the Amiga's better arcade ports. Here is the Acorn Archimedes port. This version was developed by Chrysalis Software and released by Domark in 1991. Pretty much the same team that developed many of the other computer versions, which at the time went by the name of Teak Software. Similar to the Commodore Amiga version, but we do have some big differences here. Clearly the colors used, the look of the sprites, even the music and sound effects are massive upgrades in comparison. You'll find virtually no frame drops at all with this version, and regardless of how many ghosts who want to pester you, this Archimedes game refuses to slow down. I can't really fault this game much. I mean, if there was anything, I would say that, oddly enough, some of the cutscene animations have been changed. The theater cutscene, for example. Generally, this did everything that the Amiga version gave us, but did it just that much better. There is one thing that not many of Pac-Mania's home conversions had quite right, and that was the speed of Pac-Man, but this Sega Mega Drive conversion did it just right, and it feels much more on par with the arcade game's speed. Sculptured Software, who developed this version with Tengen releasing it in 1991, also added the much needed difficulty options. We can of course select where to start the game as per usual, but here we can actually refine each of these. So for example, if I wanted to play one of the easiest levels, which would be Blocktown, by using the options menu to change the difficulty levels there, we can actually play this with the hardest possible mode. We also have a two-player mode function here, where we can actually play with a friend with alternating turns. The presentation for this game's opening and cutscene animations between levels are all very nicely implemented. There also appears to be no frame drops at all with this version. I played this all the way through, including the later jungle level, and the game is pretty much flawless in terms of a 16-bit console port. This undoubtedly would have been a great version to have in the early 90s. We are going to skip ahead 10 years of the Mega Drive version and take a quick look at the Pac-Man collection for the Game Boy Advance. Included here is a custom port of Pac-Mania. Now, it's speculated if this version is created from the original source codes from another version of the game or developed from the ground up. Sure, this is a cut down version of the game. We get no difficulty selection screen or no options, but this is a superb portable version of the game nevertheless. Next up, under honourable mentions, we have the Namco Museum Volume 5 for the PlayStation, which released back in 1997. Alongside 5 other classic Namco games, we also have a version of Pac-Mania here, specifically the Japanese version. Now, this had to be put under honourable mentions as this port wasn't built from the ground up as such, but this is actually using the arcade version's original source code. But nevertheless, this is a decent version for the PlayStation and most definitely deserves a mention here. After playing pretty much every version of Pac-Mania, I found that the Sharp X68000 1989 release of the game releasing by Namco and being developed by SPS the most superior version out of all. Now you might look at the frame rate here and notice some slight staggering. That is purely down to emulation and nothing else. Originally this game scored perfectly. It is widely praised for being the most superior port out of all ports of this game, and for good reason too. It is much like playing an arcade game only with the full screen rather than having the original vertical look. But having played so many versions, the games which did have this look were mainly the 8-bit computer versions which did struggle with frame rates. And of course the purpose of this video, as always in this series, is to find the very best version that you could have played outside of the arcade. The colours used here are almost spot on with the original pastel look that the arcade original had. The game also features the cutscene animations which are pretty much on par with the 1987 game itself. We don't get a difficulty selection screen here though, which is the only drawback here. Looking back on all of the different versions of the game over the years, generally 95% of the games are all fairly decent on their respective platforms. In comparison to some of the other arcade ports from the 1980s that I've covered in this series. I mean, Ultra Beast or Robocop, for example, had some truly terrible versions, but I cannot really say that for Pac-Mania. Anyways, that's it for today's video. I am truly feeling fairly packed out right now. Which version did you enjoy playing, and which game deserved first place? Let us know in the comments section. If you're new to this arcade port series, I'll drop a link in the comments so you can find out which other games I've covered so far. Anyways, again, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay retro.
Hey, let's...
For those of you out there who love Shinobi, and let's just face it, run and gun platformer fans largely did, then you might have got excited for Cyber Police Eswat, or more commonly known as just Eswat, when Sega released it in 1989. Both games were produced using the famous Sega System 16 board, and so you'll see very similar in visuals and style of both games here. Unlike Shinobi though, Eswat reminds me a little more of something like Robocop in terms of the storyline. We have the typical 1980s scenario as a backdrop where the streets have gotten out of hand and criminals roam around causing mayhem. And so it's up to our hero of the game, known as Duke Oda, to dismantle the issue and eventually take down a terrorist organisation who are planning world domination. The game is set around the fictional world of Liberty City, and Duke is a police officer of Liberty City Cyber Police Force. We're 15 stages away. Now, the whole analogy of Robocop is already familiar here with the police officer setup, but this becomes even more so when a few stages into the game we transform into a power suit, and this happens once Duke has been promoted to the Eswat team through the game's storyline. Prior to obtaining the power suit a few stages in, we are only armed with a pistol initially. Although it's basic, it's enough to get us through the initial stages. The game changes for the better though once the power suit has been issued, and we get to see some fairly good shooting action with a mounted machine gun as well as special weapons which varies in firepower. Ammunition is also a factor within the game. We have a limited supply of firepower throughout, but we can collect additional bullets. If we do happen to find ourselves with no ammo, then we have a rather boring kick function. To be fair, Eswat wasn't as popular as other games by Sega such as Shinobi, but it did have its audience. It's one of those games that you either loved or hated. So today then, we're going to check out which home version of Sega's 1989 Eswat was the best version you could have played. This is possibly one of the most infuriating Amstrad CPC games to play. This is the US Gold release for Sir Alan Sugar's 64K and 128K computers. Now, believe it or not, considering I had the option to play with a slightly higher spec Amstrad, in which I chose to play the 128K version, I might have expected some fairly good gameplay here. But really, I had anything but good gameplay. The CPC version, even with this higher spec, spec moves at around 2 FPS, and that is probably being generous. You will find that you press the fire button to often get nothing coming out of your pistol at all, even though you have rounds of ammo left as indicated with the HUD. What is happening here then is that the game is trying to move as quickly as possible, and it is delaying the player's joystick requests. We have no music at all here through the game, and what is there of sound effects is less than brilliant, we'll say. Sadly, just to experience the thrill of the power suit, I did have to endure this nonsense until stage 4, at which point when I did get the power suit and was dropped on top of the building by a very slow and staggering helicopter, underwhelmed is truly an understatement. At times when we're only limited to the kicking function, it's often the case that the hit detection is so bad that you can continuously hit enemies for them to continue like nothing happened. You will likely find yourself continuously being hit by bullets that are difficult to see with the backdrops and their small size. So watching yourself stumbling from left to right is commonplace when this happens. The worrying thing here is that this is also a simultaneous 2-player game. Now, if it runs this poorly with just one player, then it's likely the Amstrad CPC would just give up altogether with the prospect of somebody else playing it. US Gold released this in 1990, and in fact, US Trash released all of these computer versions. Next up, we have the Commodore 64 port. Now, you might assume here that we might get an option of at least music during the game itself. Absolutely not. What you get here is sound effects and sound effects only. Although we do get some introduction screen music, which is fairly shoddy. You might even assume that this might be a fairly decent game to play on Commodore's famous 8-bit computer. I mean, it's not really a complex game as such, but Creative Materials who developed these games for US Gold even managed to bodge it up here too. I am really beginning to believe that Creative Materials are actually Tiertex with a different name being used. Yes, these games are truly that bad. Now, despite the game having no music, we can live with that, but it's everything else here which is also missing. I mean, even the Amstrad CPC managed to get the police car rolling into stages and by helicopter, but here, absolutely nothing. We start the stages by just magically appearing. As I was playing this, I also realised that it's actually lacking in ammo box pickups. In fact, there is no ammo box pickups at all here. Instead, our ammo count displayed in the HUD is 130, which is more than the average port of this game. This is a truly bland game with very basic graphics and sprites that are so uninspiring that just comes across like a game releasing in 1983 rather than 1990. There is absolutely nothing premium looking about this game like US Gold would make themselves out to be back in the day. Granted, it's much smoother and miles more responsive with control and juke in the game, but it's far from perfect. Boss fights are boring too, and if you fancy ducking enemy bullets, think again. If we duck here, enemy bullets will hit you anyways. Out of all of the 8-bit computer versions produced, I would likely say that the ZX Spectrum version was the best. Again though, I loosely say best. We'll just say the best of a bad bunch. Eswat had 2 different versions for Spectrum, a 48K and 128K version. I'm playing the 128K version here for the best possible gameplay. Sure, it's lacking in colours, but this scrolls much nicer than the CPC version, and it looks more like the arcade game itself in terms of character designs. We also get the police car entrances, but no helicopter sadly. Now, despite these things being a little better than the other 2 computer versions, something really terrible here is up with the sound effects. We get no in-game music as per usual, so we're left with fairly questionable sound effects. It sounds much more like waves crashing against rocks rather than bullets and explosions. Controlling Duke really isn't that bad though. Sadly, much like all of the other computer versions, Duke's power suit fails to fall into pieces where he's being hit. Thankfully though, the ZX Spectrum version actually received an updated version in 2024, which improves on the game. Although I cannot rank it here due to dealing with the original releases only, but nevertheless it's definitely worth checking out. Now, you might have thought that surely if the 8-bit computers weren't powerful enough to give Eswat fans a good home port, then surely the 16-bit computers could have done better. Well, all I can say for this Atari ST version is that we do get a little more of the arcade experience. So, we get a more authentic opening to the game once it boots up. That's to say, we get some images from the arcades game, which is showing us a display of the power suit armor. But as for the game itself, well, we'll just say that this ST game looks nicer than the 8-bit versions. As a game itself though, again we get no in-game music, but once again just bland sound effects. As for the entrance into the stages, again, Duke just appears with no grand police car entrance at all. Controls here aren't too bad, but certainly not perfect either. One fairly noticeable thing here is that as we walk to the right hand side of the screen, it does seem to take a little while before enemies begin to appear. Remember those bad dudes which fire down at you from windows? Well, here their heads are actually cropped off, and all we are left with is some hands and their guns. You'll also notice that when Duke is walking on higher levels in the game, such as Loris, half of his body is cropped too. It's almost like the Atari ST sprites were just too big for the gameplay area itself. And talking about strange things, well, even the boss at the end of stage 2 is placed in a real peculiar way. As far as ammo pickups go, then unlike the Commodore 64 version, they're actually here. And these actually look nice too with their police text labelled on them. Something which doesn't look so great though is Duke's face. Literally 2 tiny black dots for eyes and a little line for a mouth. It looks very strange. For many Atari ST games, they can be fairly choppy at times. This surprisingly scrolls okay. I mean, this is absolutely no groundbreaking game and I wouldn't even recommend it, but in the context of this video, then I would say this game was just, well, okay. Considering how bad these home computer ports were, I'm going to give a quick shout out to both the Sega Mega Drive and Sega Master System versions. These weren't ports, these were actually new games entirely, although they do feature the same characters, storyline and a handful of enemies from the arcade game. New additions added were new levels and new weapons. These two versions, which Sega developed and released in 1990, are often thought of as ports. These two versions, known as Eswat City Under Siege, weren't ports of the arcades game like some people might make them out to be. These were brand new games entirely. Interestingly, although miles ahead in terms of visuals and gameplay of the arcade's computer ports, Eswat for both Sega's 8-bit and 16-bit consoles were similar games in terms of how the audience received them at the time. Definitely not going down as classics, but nevertheless do have a dedicated fan base. And what's even better for fans of Eswat, both of these games are different from each other.
Hey, let's party.
So, one of these monstrosities had to come in first place, and that place goes for the Commodore Amiga's port. Let's make this clear though, this is by no means a decent game. Although in terms of scrolling, sprite design, graphics, and even controlling Duke, then this version wins. We also get a similar opening sequence like the Atari ST's offering, but there is much more added to this game. Firstly, the police cars and helicopters. These are all here and haven't been wiped out. We even get voice voice samples here, which kind of sounds similar to the arcade game. So this has a lot going for it in comparison with the other computer versions. And in fact, this was the only version of Eswat which allowed me to get further into the game than the other versions. And that's due to how much better it controls and how much better it scrolls without lagging a few seconds behind. You'll also notice that although still a poor game, the backdrops and everything else just look that much more polished here. Although polish really is too much of a big word. The truth is, besides the Mega Drive and Master System games, Eswat never really particularly had a good home port. Sure, some were more playable than others, but these were all fairly low quality and certainly never warranted premium-like status which US Gold would brand themselves as being. Anyways, that's it for another arcade ports video. Do you think I was too harsh with the computer versions of the game? Did you actually enjoy your version of Eswat for your computer back in the day? Let us know in the comments, and if you're new to this series, I'll drop a link to my arcade ports playlist in the comments section. Anyways, again, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay retro.